Good morning. Good to see you all. My name is Andrew Herman, and I'm an elder here at Christ Community Church. I've been attending for about 15 years with Mary Beth, the awesome flute player, and my son, who is hiding somewhere back here, Benjamin. So, one quick announcement. There is no junior church, so if you hadn't gotten that message, if you go downstairs, it'll be pretty quiet. There are, if you have any kids that are a little bit younger, there are some little bags in the back with activity books and crayons and things like that they can use. Let me pray. Father, we thank you for this beautiful day you've blessed us with. Days like this make me wonder what heaven will be like, because if this is an experience of a fallen creation, what will a totally redeemed new creation be like? And so we look forward to that with anticipation and with joy. But we also are and recognize that we are in this creation, and we pray that you would help us in that endeavor, in this journey, as we go through life, and we recognize that we need you, and I pray that your Spirit would be with us today as we look at Psalm 62, as we consider your guiding us and how we respond to that, and how do we place our trust in you. And so I pray that you would help me and the words that I'm about to speak, that they would ultimately be your words, and that you would help everyone here to have a spirit of openness and receptiveness to your Spirit, and that this would be a time that we would grow closer to you and more like Christ. Ultimately, Lord, this is for your glory, and so we thank you that you are here with us today. In Jesus' name, amen. So a few weeks ago, about 4 or 6 weeks ago, I started thinking about what would be a couple of good sermons, because I'm going to be preaching today and then in 2 weeks. And had a couple of conversations with Kyle, because the youth are going to be taking over the church next Sunday for Youth Sunday. So hadn't thought about it until this moment, but I started thinking about the idea of trust and trusting in God. And so we also now need to trust in Kyle, that next week is not going to be a crazy, crazy Sunday. So that's what we're going to do. So for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at this idea of trusting God. And I just remembered, since I'm a newbie, I forgot the little clicker. Thank you. And what I'd like to focus on today is the idea of choosing to trust, right? The idea that this is an active decision that is available to us and we're challenged to make. But I couldn't help but think about the idea of trust, some of the silly things that we do, sometimes in the corporate world. I know we did it in our small group many years ago in Chicago, that wonderful activity of trust falls. So I just thought we could start showing an example of trust. Is it going to work?
Fall, and it'll be an exercise in building trust between one another. So Harrison, if you don't mind going first, step up here on this chair and close your eyes. All right, and then everybody fill in, and we're going to ask you to fall, and then they will catch you. So you have to trust us. I'm going to count to 3. Just relax and fall, okay? 1, 2, 3. No, wait, no, no!
So, clearly he didn't get the message. Yeah, so hopefully by the end of today's sermon, we'll have a better understanding of what trust is and how to process it and how to engage in it. And that it isn't really just, trust isn't about just closing our eyes and falling. That it is a more substantial and purposeful process. So on a more serious note, I want to thank Ross, both for a wonderful sermon series on Ruth, but also for setting me up quite well, because we hadn't talked. But if we think about it, the book of Ruth is a study on trust, right? Ruth, though the word trust never comes up in the book, Ruth exhibits a lot of trust. And we see it most elegantly in that towards the end of the first chapter, where Ruth, after Naomi is like, don't come back, go back to your village, go back to your people, find a new husband. And Orpah finally gives in and leaves, but Ruth says to Naomi, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. So, it's such a poignant moment, right? But infused in that statement is inherent trust that Ruth is displaying. For me, what's really interesting about that is think about the state that Naomi was in, and think about, kind of Naomi's attitude, right? 2 verses later or something, 4 verses later, she's telling people, God has brought horrible things on me, and, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara because I'm bitter and angry. Yet in the midst of that context, Ruth is able to make this statement of trust, not just in Naomi, but I truly believe behind Naomi is Ruth trusting God. Now, at the same time, I'm a little mad at Ross because he ended last week with a challenge, right? He ended, and I thought when he was ending, I was like, oh, thank you. This is great, because he ended with, how are we going to live? Are we going to live in a state of kind of anxiousness, or are we going to live in a state of trust and live from an attitude of abundance or from an attitude of kind of stinginess? And at the moment I thought, oh, this is a great setup for me for next week. But then I also thought, Ross, now I have to think about this, right? So Ross was challenging us to trust, and what are we going to trust in? And so that's what I'd like to look at today. Ultimately for me, we've got this big picture going on, right? We've got this idea of what is trust. So, what does that mean? And we'll look at that. But ultimately, every day, like Ruth, like Naomi, we're being challenged with the question, who are you going to trust? Today, will you choose to trust God? Right? Are you going to make that choice? Ruth did it beautifully. Naomi, not so much, right? She was struggling in the midst of her struggles to trust God. This is an important question. And, as I was working on this, there was a few times where I felt myself kind of, almost being not glib, but it's like, this isn't such a big deal. It is a big deal, right? And I have to remind myself, this is not easy, right? This is a big challenge certainly for me, and I'm guessing for pretty much everybody here, right? Because it raises issues of vulnerability, it raises issues of dependence, and lots of things that, especially in our good old American culture, we're not often prone to wanting to do. And so, what I want to do is look at a model to help us kind of think through this. And this isn't always about resources, right? Ross asked us, what are you going to do with your abundance? Are you going to trust God will provide what you need if you make a commitment from a time standpoint, or if you make a commitment to support somebody with your finances? Are we going to trust God? And clearly there's other issues than just the abundance part. So, Psalm 62 is one place. There's plenty of places that we could look at to start to unpack this idea of trust. But I'd like to look at Psalm 62. And David has crafted a really great psalm that really starts to give us some ways to think about and to focus on trust. This psalm is a reflection of David's life. So we're going to see things in it that reflect aspects of David's life. It's also it's guiding David. So we're going to see stuff in there that he's drawing on, kind of self-talk, and how is he helping himself. There was a part of me that was thinking, well, that's David, right? He was a king, so what kind of struggles did he have? And, I don't have people, trying to overthrow my throne and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, David's experiences, though, might be unique to his position, but what he was feeling, how he was processing, what he needed to draw on from a resource standpoint is no different than it is for us. As my old high school teacher in social studies used to like to say as we were studying this president or this person, it's like, well, you remember, everybody has to put their pants on one leg at a time, right? So David was, in a similar position. So just because he was king, his emotional responses and things aren't unique to him. And I think it's something we can all relate to. So in this psalm, David has created three chunks that I'd like us to look at. So the first one is kind of David's external reality, right? So, what's happening kind of around David and what is he experiencing? The second chunk is what I'm calling David's internal reality. And so we'll kind of see a contrast there. And then the third chunk, perhaps maybe the most important, would be God's reality. So kind of the 30,000 feet view of what does this all really mean. So let's look at these chunks one at a time. So David's external reality. So this is, I'm going to read the first 4 verses of Psalm 62. Sorry, I thought the text would be big enough. I guess it is not bad up here. I'm looking back there and it's like, it's kind of small. So verses 1 through 4. For the director of music, for Jeduthun, a psalm of David. Truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. How long will you assault me? Would all of you throw me down, this leaning wall, this tottering fence? Surely they intend to topple me from my lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. Selah. So, interesting little kind of 180-degree turn there at verse 3. We don't know David's specific situation. Some psalms, in the beginning it'll say, while he was being chased by this, or while Absalom was trying to do that. This one, we don't know, and so all we can do is see what's literally written down here. But clearly, David is being assaulted, right? And he's feeling vulnerable. He describes himself as in verse 3, as a leaning wall, a tottering fence. Reminds me, my I have one brother who isn't the smartest at times, and an uncle who, at least at that age, wasn't the smartest at times, and the two of them combined, you can get an idea. So my uncle was at our house one day. I think he was coming over to go out into our fields to cut a Christmas tree, and so my brother Mike is like, oh, I'll go with you, Joe, and so off they go, and before they get off our property, they get distracted because we had a couple of barns on our property, and I don't know, I wasn't there. I was in the house. I don't know, so I don't know how the conversation started, but they're like, yeah, that barn doesn't look, the next thing you know, I don't know if you're familiar, barns have lightning rods on the top of the barn, and then a big copper wire that comes down the side. So my brother and uncle get the brilliant idea of wrapping the lightning rod around a beam as like a fulcrum leverage, and then they're jumping up and down on this beam, and next thing you know, the barn is swaying. I mean, this was a barn that should have come down, but they decided to take matters into their own hands, and so it becomes this tottering fence, this leaning wall, and I don't know what they were thinking. It's like, okay, and suddenly it kept going. Inertia took over, and it started, of course it falls in their direction, and so the two of them are like running across this ditch and things, and they still don't know how they kind of got between this two trees that shouldn't have had two humans, but right? And we're in the house, and suddenly we hear this huge crash, and like and our barn is like in a shambles. So, in that moment, they, there was this tottering fence. How does that feel, right? And David is just feeling extremely vulnerable. And these people are out to get him. It's kind of like, and then, it's also interesting how he describes them. These people, they take delight in lies. With their mouths, they bless, but in their hearts, they curse, right? It kind of reminded me of a scene. I have to do this in homage to the Otis family. With their hearts, they bless, and with their mouths, they bless, with their hearts, they curse. Kind of reminds me. And there's that scene where, who's talking? Is it the nice guy, Smeagol? Is it the bad guy, Gollum? And there's like this ongoing, and he's like, oh no, I'll help you find, he's talking to Frodo and say, oh, I can help you, and no, I'm here to help you. And then, then Gollum comes like, oh, let's push him off the rock, let's kill him, right? And so there's this, in these people, there's this duplicitness that David is recognizing, right? And how is this affecting him? So that's David's state, right? That's what's going on around him. But let's go back and look at verses 1 and 2. So where does David start this, right? So it's important, right? How does he kind of start his understanding of his experience? Truly, my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken, right? So that's David's starting point. It's not, all these people are out to get me, and the world is, and I'm about to topple, and people are trying to knock me. It's, no. My soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly, God is my rock and salvation, my fortress. What's interesting is in that verse where it says, my soul, that's the word nephesh in Hebrew, which is, when I think of soul in our kind of contemporary language, we kind of think of that spiritual component. But it's much more inclusive than that. And can include our lifeblood, our very inner being of who we are. In fact, in Genesis, in chapter 2, it's talking about the creation of man. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of nephesh, the breath of life. And the man became a living nephesh, a living being. Right? So it's everything that kind of animates us is what David is really getting at when he talks about his soul. And that idea of salvation Again, when I think about that, it's like, have you been saved, right? Salvation in that sense. And that kind of, okay, I've got, I'm going to heaven. And in this case, for David especially, the Hebrew word there is Yeshua. Right? So that's the same word that we would ultimately translate into Jesus. And that word, again, has a broad range of meanings beyond just saving my soul. It's really about deliverance, prosperity, victory, this kind of broad understanding of our lives and what God is doing in our lives day to day. So for me, how could I even rework those opening verses to start my day? Truly my soul, my very being, all that I am, finds rest in God. My salvation, any assurance of deliverance or victory this day comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. Right? And that's kind of David's mindset and why he is able to then face these enemies. It's interesting, David puts a pause in there. So after verse 4, there's a pause. And I think he's asking his readers, his listeners, if this was being sung, pause, right? Stop. And, I want to take just 15 seconds. Can you pause and think about a situation, a time in your life where you felt like that leaning fence, that tottering wall, you felt like you could be pushed over with, a slight breeze because you were feeling attacked, you were feeling vulnerable, challenged. So I'd like to, can you get into the mindset that David was in when he wrote this psalm? So just give you 15 seconds to kind of place yourself there. So why we want to be there is because of the next section. Right? David sets up a contrast from his external reality to his internal reality. So what is David's internal reality? So let's look at the next chunk of Psalm 62. Yes, my soul finds rest. Yes, my soul, find rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock and my refuge. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Selah. So again, he asks his listeners to pause again. So the first couple of verses there are just a slight variation of how he started the whole psalm. So he changes it up just a little bit, but verses 5 and 6 are very similar to verses 1 and 2. But then 7 and 8 are kind of interesting. They kind of, in my mind, I kind of saw like a curtain opening or a veil moving. It's like, so what's really going on in David's head, and how is he thinking to even make those other claims of 5 and 6. And so verse 7, we see David kind of making claims about himself. My salvation and my honor depend on God, right? Where is his focus again? It's on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust, and then verse 8 kind of flips. It's kind of interesting where, verse 7, he's kind of talking about himself, and then verse 8 flips into talking to his listeners, right? Trust in him, in God at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. right? So he's making these exhortations to his listeners of what to do, right? I do believe just because David is talking about himself in verse 7 and then exhorting us in verse 8, both verses apply to all of us. I'm sure he was exhorting himself at times, like in verse 8, and telling himself, got to trust in God, just like we can claim verse 7 and say that our salvation and honor depend on God, right? So rhetorically, he makes some changes, but they apply for both of us. So for me, this sets up a really great contrast, right, to the first section, where life seems to be out of control, and there's, the tottering fences, and people are out to get me, and this is kind of like the calm port, that I come back to. This gets back to what I said at the beginning. This isn't easy, right, in the midst of all these challenges, to be able to just say, oh yeah, trust in God, and God is. No, I recognize it's a challenge, but certainly, David had his challenges, and he's able to come back and make these claims. What does it mean then to trust in him, right? He tells us in verse 8, trust in him at all times. And I'd like to argue or suggest that, this idea of trusting in him is not this kind of vague, fuzzy notion. It's not stand up, close your eyes, and fall just because somebody has told you to. That's not real trust. And in fact, trust actually has, there's a number of different ways to look at trust. And so I've pulled up one that I think is really helpful. Tons of research on this stuff, trust in organizations. It was part of my dissertation 20 years ago. Here's 3 pillars of trust that I think are really relevant. And we see God doing. So one of them is ability, right? We choose to trust somebody if they show that they have the ability. Do they have the competence to fulfill, to do what they claim they're able to do, right? And David has experienced that, right? And he sees God as a rock and a fortress. And if you think about that imagery coming from David, he spent a lot of time in rocks that acted as fortresses as he was being chased around by Saul, right? And so for him, even that idea of the rock is very poignant, right? But David saw that God had the ability to take care of him, right? So ability is one of those pillars of trust. Another one is integrity, right? Does the person live the way they say they are going to live the way they say you should live, right? And we see, God consistently in his interactions with David acting in the way that he expects David to live. And so, David experiences God living and acting from a point of integrity. And then the third pillar is benevolence. That idea of, does this person have your well-being in mind? Are they concerned about your welfare? Are they concerned, do they treat you with generosity and kindness? And how do they approach you that way? And certainly, David has seen that, right? But the idea here is, when we choose to trust, these are things, consciously or unconsciously, that we're going to be processing, right? Naomi wasn't feeling this, right? She lost her food. She lost her family. She's like, God, I don't know if you've got the ability, right? And so it was causing her not to trust. Ruth was feeling it from some perspective, right? The narrative doesn't really tell us how and why, but she chooses to trust. David really experienced it, and that's not without struggle, but he experienced it, and so he's able to tell himself and tell us, trust in him at all times. Trust in God at all times, because he has the ability, he has integrity, he is benevolent, right? So, that's what we need to do Are we doing what David is doing himself? And rehearsing those times when God has been benevolent to me, when God accomplished through me and in me what I needed, what he needed me to do, right? And there's that relationship. So I want to move now to the last part, God's reality, right? So we've got David's external reality, his internal reality that is trying to be a buffer to that external reality. What about God's reality? So I would say the most important perspective. So let's look at the last chunk of Psalm 62, verse 9. Surely the lowborn are but a breath, the highborn are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they are nothing. Together they are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or put vain hope in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. One thing God has spoken, two things I have heard. Power belongs to you, God, and with you, Lord, is unfailing love. And you reward everyone according to what they have done. I love verse 9. There was another translation, the highborn in this, the one I read says, the highborn are but a lie. Another translation says, the highborn are a delusion. Right? And it's like, you think about it, it's like, surely the lowborn are but a breath. If you think you're highborn, you're deluded, so what are you? You're a lowborn, you're a breath, right? And of anybody who knows this, it would be David, right? He was both a lowborn, right? He was like the scrawniest, beat up little kid in the family, abused by all of his older brothers. We don't know anybody like that, right? But then suddenly over time, he becomes king of Israel. But he recognizes that kind of delusional, temporary nature of what that is like. It's kind of like James, right? In James chapter 4, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this city or that city and spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. Got to find the rest of the passage. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And, that's actually a picture I took out of Carol's balloon as we were up in a basket and we were going over Letchworth Park, and it's like, here's this mist. And, within 20 minutes, gone, right? And it's interesting, right? It's there, and then suddenly, poof, right? That's our lives. And David, is reflecting that when he's talking about, we are only a breath. And that's an important reminder. And then in verse 10, what else is he reminding us of? Right? Despite that, we still try, right, in our own strength. How am I going to succeed? How am I going to do this? How am I going to, right? So maybe I'll, try a little extortion, or, I'm going to have, my hope in this, and I'm going to try that. And sometimes it works, right? It's like, oh, my pocketbook is a little bit bigger. But ultimately, his warning to us is don't set our hearts on that. How come, right? Why shouldn't we do that? And in verses 11 and 12, David tells us why, right? One thing God has spoken. Two things I have heard, right? Ultimately, where's the power? Where's the authority? Power belongs to you, God, and with you is unfailing love, right? So it's this contrast, we as humans are always trying. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, I'm going to make this work. And David is trying to check that inclination and say, you know what? Ultimately, the power is with God, but within that power is also God's unfailing love, right? And so, it's this kind of beautiful mixture of care and source of power. Or getting back to the idea of trust, right? God has the power. He has the ability. he's also benevolent. He is a source of unfailing love. He also has the integrity. It's interesting, David in these verses kind of trigger all of that. And ultimately, God is going to reward everyone according to what they have done, right? And that's where David leaves us, kind of sitting there. So, what does all this mean? I've titled this sermon, Choosing to Trust, right? I'd like you to do me a favor. If you haven't done so, open up the Pew Bible and find Psalm 62, or if it's on your tablet. I'd like you to take a moment and read through now Psalm 62. And I'd like you to look every time David makes a claim about God, or David makes a claim or notes an observation about his relationship to God. And what do you see in these claims? What do you see in these observations that David makes? So just take a moment, see how many you can even count. I counted about 15. It's depending on how you kind of chunk up the different clauses and things. But what do you see David's doing and saying? Do you see what David is doing for himself? You see all the ways he is reminding himself. And I'm sure as he's writing these or singing these words, there's images coming into his head, right? He's remembering being in those caves in the rocks, being protected by God, right? He's reminding himself why he can trust God and who God is and why our God is a trustworthy God. Right? He's choosing to trust God. And we can do the same thing, right? For me, going back, and how can I integrate into even my daily life, verses 1 and 2, truly my soul, my very being, all that I am finds rest in God. My salvation, any assurance or deliverance or victory this day comes from God. Truly, God is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken, right? Can I say that and remember those times that I've experienced that? And the more I do that, the more confidence I then have in being able to say this. Some of us might not be able to. Like, when I think, it's like, I can't really think about. And this psalm is a fitting psalm for today because we're also, as you can see, celebrating communion, right? And communion is the ultimate example of why we can trust in God. It's the ultimate example of the power of God. David didn't have the cross to draw on. David didn't have the resurrection. David couldn't celebrate communion. He could go into the temple, and he did, or into the tabernacle, and he could have a relationship with God, but he did not have this, right? And that's an incredible gift that God has given us. So how much more, because of the cross, because of the resurrection, can we read Psalm 62 with confidence that our God is a God that we can trust? Communion is a reminder, right? It's a lot of things, but it's certainly a reminder. The bread, the juice that we'll partake in points us back to that death. It points us back to the broken body, the spilled blood of Christ. A reminder of Yeshua, right? That person who has created a complete salvation for us. It's also a reminder and points us to the resurrection and the future banquet table that we will share with Christ in the future. So all of this brings back to God's trustworthy, right? God has the ability, he has the power. He raised Christ from the dead, right? That power is in God. He's also benevolent. God so loved the world, right, that he gave us Christ. So whoever believes in him will be saved. And he's good to his word. He said that's what he would do, and he did it. So what I want to do before we participate in communion, I want to give you time. I often feel like I don't give myself time to think and to meditate. So I want to give you some time. Here are some of my takeaways from this week, or from preparing this. God is worthy of my trust. Right? I need to start each day choosing to trust in our God. I'm starting to think, how can I make this a card? It's going to sit on my desk. And before I put my computer down on my desk at work, I'm going to see this. So the next time I have this problematic this or this struggle, I'm going to start the day seeing this. It's important to recall all the ways that God has shown himself to be worthy of my trust. But ultimately, if I can't think of any this particular day or this particular moment, I can always think about the cross. I can always think about communion. What I want to do is give us about 5 minutes. We're going to play a little music, some quiet music, and I want you to think about your situation. Are you feeling like a tottering wall, a leaning fence? Perhaps read Psalm 62 again. You could, interestingly, go back to Psalm 119 that was read at the beginning and read through that again. But I want to give you a little bit of time to prepare for communion by thinking about the God that we trust. I've put a few prompts up here that you can consider. Whoops. But we're going to just play some music. It'll be about 5 minutes, and then we'll participate in communion.